So I guess kind of the first thing I want to know is how you kind of got started in this the rescuing business here.
It started back in 1992, and my late husband and I were going to an auction to buy some llamas. And this guy came in with a bobcat on a leash, and he was selling the bobcat. And the people next to me were bidding on this bobcat. And I had done bobcat rehab and release, like if a bobcat gets hit by a car, you fix them up and then put them back in the wild. I'd been doing that since I was like 17 years old. So I turned to the guy next to me and I said, "These cats are vicious. That cat's going to tear your face off." And he said, "I'm a taxidermist. I'm just going to club her in the head in the parking lot and turn her into a den decoration." And so I broke down crying, and my husband started bidding on the cat, and we came home with a bobcat. And that was our first understanding that these animals were being exploited this way. So the next year, we rescued 56 cats from a fur farm. The next year, 28 off a fur farm. The next year, 22 off a fur farm. And then people started calling and saying, "Hey, would you take my lion? Would you take my tiger?" I'm like, "What are you people doing with lions and tigers?" So that was how it all got started.
So are there really all these kinds of bobcats just out there at auctions? How is that how you acquire most of your animals?
It's mostly tigers. Um, we started out because we rescued so many from fur farms, and the cats on the fur farms are either bobcats or lynx, which bobcats are in the lynx family. And after those first 3 years, we had wiped out all of the fur farms in the United States. So there aren't any more places that are killing bobcats for their fur or lynx for their fur in the United States. They still do in Canada, but we were trying to get the cats out of Canada in '97 when I lost my husband. And we just never were able to finish that. But since then, there have been so many calls. I mean, at our very worst, we got 312 calls to rescue mostly tigers in a single year.
Ah, so where are people getting these in the first place?
Where?
The animals.
The primary reason that there are so many tigers available as pets is because people will pay to have their picture made with a cub. And the cubs can only be handled between the ages of 8 and 12 weeks. So once they hit 12 weeks, I mean, that's only like, what, 3 months old? Then the
Yeah.
breeders have to just give them away because it's going to cost them $10,000 a year to take care of that animal for the rest of its life, and they don't want to do that. So they'll give them away to people and say, "Oh, it's been bottle raised, and you can raise it just like a dog, and it's going to love you like you were its mother." And people are stupid enough to believe that and take the tiger home, and then a year later, that animal's 200, 300 pounds, and they can't deal with it, and that's when we get the call.
So most of your animals come in at a super young age.
No, we get those calls from people all the time, but we can't take more than 5 or 6 cats a year. And typically, the cats that we take are the older ones. And the reason that we do that is because we are particularly good with geriatric issues. But another reason is that whenever we take an animal from somebody, we make them sign a contract with us that says they're never going to get another exotic cat. And most people won't sign that because they want to go get another cute little cub to play with, and they'll just dump it again. And so these animals just keep being dumped into worse and worse situations until they disappear off the radar. We believe that they're being killed for their parts because the US is only second to China as far as the volume of tiger parts being illegally sold. And so you can imagine people that would rip a cub from its mother and pimp it out to anybody that would pay $25 to have their picture made. Those same people are surely going to sell these animals for tens of thousands of dollars for their parts to the illegal Asian medicinal trade.
Oh, is that something you've encountered frequently? Is like kind of a really bad black market for them, or tell me about some of like the nasty people you've had to deal with.
They're horrible people. And it's really hard to catch them because there's virtually no record keeping. And so if USDA comes to your facility and you have 10 tigers this year and they come back again next year, because they usually only come once a year, come back the next year, you got 10 tigers. The next year you have 10 tigers. You could have been selling hundreds of tigers in between, but as long as you keep that number that they're allowed to see down to 10, they'll never know how many have been sold. And so that's where they are disappearing into the what we think is the illegal trade. Because what we've been able to do is go on like Flickr and YouTube and Facebook, and we take screenshots of all of the cubs that are being handled, And then we track, where these are and where they don't end up later. If they're at one facility and then they're not there the next year, then we know they've just kind of disappeared off the radar. And there's like 200 of those a year that are being handled but don't show up on anybody else's census. So it's just been an impossible thing to prove, even though we truly believe that it is happening. There was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did an undercover sting back in 2006. And during that, it was 5 or 6 year long operation. They discovered that these animals were being cut up for their parts and sold out of a place in Chicago called Zimmer's. It was a meat, exotic meats. They'd sell like kangaroo and ostrich and those kinds of meats. And they were selling lion meat, which, believe it or not, is legal. But they were killing and skinning tigers and selling tiger meat and calling it lion meat. And tigers are endangered species, so that's illegal. So they've caught them doing it, but it took, like I said, 5 or 6 years. And then once they cited all of these people, they got minimal fines, minimal jail time, and nothing happens of any consequence. They just figure it's the cost of doing business, and so it just keeps happening over and over and over again.
It took 5 or 6 years and nothing came of it.
Well, I mean, they got fined and some people went to jail, but it was just such minimal sentencing that it wasn't a big deal to them, and most of those people are right back out in business. There's another guy by the name of Mario Tabro, and he actually went to jail for 12 years. He was implicated in both the murder of his wife and the murder of a USDA informant, and I don't know the entire story. If you Google his name, you'll be able to find it. But they said that he had cut up the USDA informant with a machete and shoved his body in a barrel. And when drug enforcement showed up at his facility, because he had like a multi-million-dollar marijuana ring, he threw $50,000 out the back window of his house, hoping his wife was going to catch it, and instead the DEA agent caught it. And so they were able to put him and his father and a bunch of other people in prison. But 12 years later, he's right back out on the street. He's right back out there importing and exporting endangered species again under the name of, I think he's using zoological imports now. And these people act with just total abandon because there just aren't strong enough laws to keep them from doing these awful things to animals.
Sorry for any pauses. That's me typing.
Yeah, I can hear the typing. I hear a lot of background noise.
Part of that is my ceiling fan.
Yeah.
All right. So when you go in for a rescue mission, if you're going to say a failed sanctuary or something like that, tell me about some of the conditions that you guys have found and what's really been left to be desired.
It was just last month we rescued 3 tigers from a facility in New York. It was called J&K's Call of the Wild. If you went on their website, it was this glowing, we're a sanctuary and we take wonderful care of our animals, and they're soliciting donations. And people had no idea the horrid conditions that these animals were actually living in, and the fact that they had bred most of the animals that they had. So there were, I think, 11 tigers, and of the 11 tigers that were there was only one of them that they hadn't bred at the facility. And so we were asked to come in and rescue 4 cats. One of the cats had died before we even got there. We were asked to come in February of this year, but because the legal process took so long, they weren't able to let us in until May 27th. And by the time we got there, the cats were literally starving to death. I have never seen tigers so skinny in my entire life, and they were so thirsty that when we caught up the 3 that we were taking and put them on the transport wagon, or transport vehicle, on the way home, which was a 22-hour ride, those 3 cats drank 8 gallons of water because they hadn't been getting water or food or any kind of care. It was so typical of what I see when I go into a rescue. They're small cages. They keep the cats usually on concrete or on rocks. The reason they do that is because it's easy to just spray off with a hose, and they don't have to worry about keeping it's a lot harder if you're trying to clean poop out of grass than cleaning it off of concrete or rocks. But that's really hard on the cat's feet. They're walking around on those rocks all day long or on the concrete. A lot of these cats have been declawed. And so when they declaw them, it's been illegal to do it since 2004. So people do it with pruning shears and all kinds of ways without anesthesia because the vets aren't allowed to do it. And I don't think any cat should be declawed, but I'm saying it doesn't, making a rule that says you can't declaw a cat doesn't keep people from doing it. They still do it. They just do it in even worse, inhumane methods. But then those cats are having to walk around on those butchered paws on those rocks and on the concrete. And so the cats who came here, they've got claws growing out the sides of their feet and the tops of their feet. And I can't even imagine how horrible their life must have been to be on those rocks. And the only place they could get off the rocks was to go in a little wooden den. And this wooden den had a door on the front and a door on the back. So they would shut the door on the front so the cat couldn't go in, open the door on the back and throw the food in. And so the cat was doing all of their eating in there, and yet it wasn't being cleaned out. So in the video that we have, you can just see the flies are just swarming out of this den. So the only place the cat can go is in this filthy, fly-infested, stinking area and lay in their own filth and rotting food. And so the cats had urinary tract infection from laying in that, and all of that could be prevented just by cleaning the cage, feeding the cat, giving the cat water. But these people that have them get in over their heads, and they can't take on that huge cost for the rest of the animal's life, and so the animals end up suffering, usually in silence and usually behind closed gates where nobody knows, and then they die.
So I was reading around the website a little bit, and just kind of looking at some of the stuff that you've had out there. I noticed you've got a book that's telling you, not to open a sanctuary, basically. Can you tell me a little bit more about why opening a sanctuary is a bad idea?
It's just not the answer. And if I knew 20 years ago what I know now, I never would have rescued that first animal. And, even though that cat would have died a horrible death, I could have saved thousands of cats if I had known what I know now. And what I know now is the only way this is ever going to change is to change the laws. And so I spend most of my time now lobbying for better laws to protect the animals, trying to get lawmakers to enforce bans, to enact and enforce bans, so that people can't get their hands on them in the first place. And the number one thing, if there was one thing I could do just say, call it a day, this is everything I've ever done in my life, it would be to stop the cub handling, because that's what's fueling this whole thing, is the cub handling. And there's no reason why a person should be allowed to touch a baby tiger or baby lion. You can't do it in the wild. We shouldn't force them into cages where we can rip away their cubs and do it here in captivity.
You mentioned earlier that you don't use anesthesia on some of these animals. Why don't you do that?
Well, if they have to be sedated for like surgery or something, we do. What we do is operant conditioning to do as much of the medical work as we can without anesthesia. So like today, I've got to give a leopard a shot. It's just a regular vaccine, and they have to get their vaccines once a year. So by teaching her to come to the side of the cage to get a treat off of a stick, and do you know what clicker training is for a dog?
Yeah.
You give them a treat, you use a clicker.
Yeah.
We do the same thing with the cat. So we give them a treat and we click, and that says, yeah, that's what I want you to do. So one of the things we ask the cats to do is lean up against the fence. And most of the time they can't even feel it when we're giving them an injection. So if we can get them to lean up against the fence and give them an injection, we don't have to hit them with a dart gun or a dart rifle or something like that, which has way more impact than just gently doing it by hand. A lot of the other things that we have to treat, like if they have, if they've got a cut, or if they have, I don't know, there's not that much that they do to themselves in the cages, but if they're limping around or something, like these cats that have been declawed, one of the things we teach them to do is put their paws up so we can check their paws and see, oh yeah, they got this claw growing into their paw. and they know their right paw from their left paw. Their ears are often, they get like infections and stuff, so they'll stick their right ear out or their left ear out and let us look at it. And all of that, they think they're just, playing a game, but we're doing veterinary care while they're having fun and getting treats for doing it. So we have about 100 volunteers, and they come in really early in the morning to do operant conditioning with the cats so that all of our cats are used to that kind of clicker training. But like yesterday, we had a leopard that had a mass on his chin. Well, we can't get up underneath his chin and see what that is and draw out a piece of it for testing to see if it's cancer. So we actually did have to sedate him in order to do that. But it's easier to sedate him if he's used to coming over and leaning up against the fence and letting you do that.
Okay. That's really cool.
Yeah.
I had no idea you would be teaching these people that, or teaching these cats like that.
It happened when we rescued a bunch of circus tigers, and they sent their trainer over and they said, we've been teaching these cats to do things that we need them to do for medical purposes, not just jumping through hoops. And so she was showing us how to do it with the tigers, and our other cats were like, oh, I can do that. And they were doing all of the same, the paws and the ears and the turning around and the laying down and all of the things we were asking the cat right next to them to do, they would do on cue too. So we were like, okay, well, I'll give you a treat for that. And then the next cat down would be like, well, I can do that. And so it just, now they're all doing it.
That's really cool.
They're smart.
Yeah, you wouldn't think that like they'd be able to respond like that after years of abuse and all of that kind of stuff. That's really great that they're able to do that with you.
The biggest thing is they're so bored out of their minds because cats are so intelligent and they just don't belong in cages. And so for them, doing that kind of stuff is like, it's entertainment for them. And if they don't want to do it, if it's hot or they just had dinner and they're like, I'm full, I don't want any treats, then they don't have to do it. Whereas if they're in a circus act or something, they're forcing those animals to do those acts.
So how many times have you gotten calls from a circus saying, hey, we have this really old tiger, can you take it? How does that kind of situation work?
We had one very large situation, and we're not allowed to use their name, even though they use our name all the time. But they had 20 cats that belonged to a trainer who was dying of cancer. And that trainer came out here and he said, this is heaven. This is where I want my cats to go. And they tried for a while to use his cats with other trainers, and the cats just wouldn't perform with the other trainers. So there were 20 of these cats, and as they proved that they weren't going to work with other trainers, they would retire them to us 2 or 3 at a time until the last of them has arrived. And now there's actually only 2 of them still alive. That was back in 2000. And what was interesting to me is I really hate the circus. I hate that whole idea. I know that the cats are hit with cattle prods and all kinds of stuff to make them perform. But the cats that they sent here were in their late teens when they arrived. Most of them. There were 2 5-year-olds, but everybody else was like 15 to 17 years old. And most places, even your best zoos, tigers don't live past 10 or 12. And so it showed me that cats living in the circus actually are enduring less stress and less bad management in circus acts than they are in zoos. And that was a huge wake-up call to me that these cats just don't belong in cages, period. Here at the sanctuary, the cats usually live into their late teens and early 20s, which is like double their lifespan anywhere else.
Huh. So I read on the site that you have one lioness that was found in a drug bust.
Yeah.
Tell me about how that worked.
The drug dealers love to use lions and cougars because they're not endangered species. You can buy them anywhere on the internet for $100 as a cub. They can raise them up in the house, and for the first year or 2, the animal is pretty handleable, even though it can, by the time it's 2 years old, it could be 500 pounds. It still is kind of mentally a kitten until they're 3 or 4, 5 years old. So the drug dealers get these animals, they use them to, 1, guard their stash from other drug dealers that might steal from them, and 2, if drug enforcement shows up, they just set the cats loose because they're not so worried about the cats coming after them. Drug enforcement sees a 500-pound lion running at them. They think that this is, a full-grown adult that's going to tear their face off, and usually shoot the cats. And that gives the people, the drug dealers, the time to run out the back door with the drugs and the money. And so once those cats get too big to use, they can very easily disappear into the trade for their bones and their skin and their meats. Um, or in the case of cougars, we know that they frequently just turn them loose because cougars are a native animal to the U.S. And there's been hunters who have shot cougars that were declawed. Well, those cougars didn't go out and get themselves declawed in the wild. So obviously these are pets that people couldn't handle anymore and have turned loose and are probably from similar type situations as this. In the case that you're talking about, that was Nikita the lion, and drug enforcement came in, they turned the cat loose on him, and thankfully they had somebody come in from the zoo and tranquilize her rather than kill her. And so they took her to the zoo, but the zoos don't want these animals. The zoos want to have cute little babies every year because that's what the people will pay to come see. And so all of these animals that are in private hands came from the zoos, from them breeding every year and then just dumping the animals out the back door to brokers who then sell them to people as pets. And so they don't want the animals, and they contacted us and said, we don't want this cat anymore. And this was back before we had the contract where we said you can't have any more cats. That's been something we've kind of learned over time, that all right, we can't just be a dumping ground because people will be dumping on you every year and just going out and making the problem worse. So we told the zoo we would take the cat, and when she got here they shipped down not only her but 3 bobcats with her because they knew we weren't going to send the bobcats back to them, but they didn't want them any longer because they weren't good zoo displays.
So, tell me a little bit about how building an enclosure works.
All of the enclosures out here have been built by my father. He pretty much has worked by himself. He's 72 years old, and he still works 6 days a week out here. He had triple bypass surgery a couple of years ago, so now he has some help that does work on the cages. But we have 2 different styles of cage. One is the style that he came up with, and it doesn't require any supports because it's rounded. The fence is stood up. It's a 6-gauge steel 4x4-inch mesh panel that's been galvanized, and so we stand it up and curve the wall, and it's in that curve that makes it strong. And then he'll stand a rake on each side, bring the next piece, stand up that piece, and snap it together with those, like the snap like on a horse bridle. We have those snaps with the snaps on both ends. We'll snap them all together, and then he'll go back and use hog rings, which are a ring that you close up with a pair of pliers like that to seal it shut and bring the whole thing together, and then he puts the roofs up on top of them. The new style that we've started doing is it's 15 feet high with a 5-foot cantilever at the top, so it's open to the sky except for this cantilever so that the cats can't go backwards upside down and get out. We've been able to do a lot larger cages in that. For like a bobcat, which is a 20-pound cat, their cage size is 1,200 square feet, so that's like bigger than most people's house for a single cat. For the tigers, they're 2,400 square feet at the very minimum. Our largest tiger cage is 3 acres. And then last year we built a 2.5-acre area with that cantilever style that is our vacation rotation enclosure. So each of the lions and tigers and leopards and cougars gets a 2-week vacation out there, and they spend 2 weeks swimming in the lake out there, playing in the fountain. They've got trees, they've got platforms, and then they go back to their cage, and the next cat gets their 2-week vacation. So one of the things we're working on right now, when you were talking about humor earlier, I'm thinking, yeah, it's pretty funny that the cats here are smarter than we are. We have 2 leopard sisters that have been on vacation for the last 2 weeks. So their vacation's up, and we managed to catch one of them and put them back in the cage, but Armani is still on vacation because she's like, I'm not going in that transport cage. I've got this whole thing to myself here. So
Oh, that's smart.
yeah, leopards are the smartest of the cats, but we're gonna really be beating our heads against the wall for the next few hours trying to figure out how to get her out of the vacation cage.
Yeah. So, to what extent do places that you're rescuing animals from follow these kind of enclosure guidelines that you guys have? Like, how closely do their styles mirror yours?
Well, it's kind of a mixed bag because there are probably 200 places out there that call themselves sanctuaries but are breeding or allowing public contact or doing things that sanctuaries should never do. There are maybe 30 sanctuaries that don't buy, breed, sell, or allow public contact or take the animals off site, like to a school or something like that, because that's very stressful for the animal. So out of those 30, there is a huge range of how the animals are kept, from some of them that have rather smallish enclosures to some that have enclosures far larger than ours. There's a place out in Colorado where his cages are 10 acres each. Now he's got a whole bunch of cats in each one of those 10-acre cages, and that's something that just scares the bejesus out of me, because I would not try to introduce 2 adult tigers, because I can't break it up if they start killing each other, and I don't know how he does, but he manages to do it because he's out in Colorado and has huge tracts of land. His cage walls are just straight up and down. I don't think he has a cantilever on his. I've seen places that mirror the type of cages that we use. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about that is there was a place here in Florida, and when we had like 5 hurricanes that came through in a 4-week period. It was just crazy. It was several years ago. And there were 2 facilities next door to each other. One of them was a zoo facility and the other was this accredited sanctuary. And the zoo facility had completely been smashed to the ground. Every cage was down. All the animals were running loose. The place that had mimicked the way we do the cages with the rounded walls, all of those cages were still standing even after the hurricane. So even though we've never taken a direct hit here, we've seen how our cage does work in places that have taken direct hits.
Okay. That's good.
Yeah.
Oh.
It's encouraging.
Yeah. So I guess kind of back to the legislative stuff. I know you've been working on that. What kind of successes have you had in the legislative end of things?
In 2003, we had to turn away 312 big cats. Because like I said, we can only rescue 5 or 6.
1,200?
312.
Oh, 312. Oh, sorry.
We can only rescue 5 or 6 each year as our older cats die of old age. We won't kill a cat to make space. So we weren't even hitting, 2 or 3% of the number of cats that needed rescuing. We could only rescue, like I said, 2 or 3% of that huge number. For 6 years, we had been working on a federal bill to ban the interstate trade in big cats. And finally, in 2003, that bill passed. It was called the Captive Wildlife Safety Act. And what that bill did was that it made it illegal to sell a big cat across state lines as a pet. And even though there were a lot of parameters, because that's a lot of hoops.
Sorry, what was the name of that?
The Captive Wildlife Safety Act. And it passed in December of 2003. And it prohibited the sale of big cats across state lines as pets. So zoos could still sell animals back and forth. USDA facilities could still sell animals back and forth, but you couldn't sell an animal to somebody that wanted them as a pet. Every other year, the number of cats we had been turning away had been doubling. And so the very next year after that bill passed, we were looking at thinking, oh my gosh, we're going to get like 400 or 500 people calling us to take big cats. And instead, it was 160. And so what we've seen since then is 9 more states have passed bans or partial bans. And as that has happened, the number of big cats who end up being displaced, and those calls that we get from people to say, come rescue my lion or tiger, those have dropped to the point where last year we only got 37 calls. So out of those 37, I think we took 11 cats. So we took like 30% of the problem, whereas in 2003 we could only take care of 2% of the problem. So the legislation is the only way we're going to fix this, and it's obvious from the numbers that we're seeing.
Really good to hear.
Yeah.
And looking at my notes here. So what other improvements have you guys been able to make as a sanctuary to improve quality of life, and what sort of other things have you seen other sanctuaries doing that have been kind of working toward that same goal?
One of the things that we did here back in 2009 is we converted all of our paper systems. Like if we see a cat has puked up a frog, there would be a log where you would write that on the log, and then I would go and look at the log to see who has puked up a frog. we took all of that and made it into a digital database where all of our keepers, when they go out and take care of the animals in the morning, they come back into a computer, and we have computers all over the place here, and they will log everything that they saw while they were out there. It's a Google Education app software, so whenever they log it, immediately I get an email. If it's a veterinary issue, our vets get an email. If it's something that our operations manager needs to know about, she gets an email that's just automated. They don't even have to send it to me. As soon as they put it into the chart, we get these emails. And so in real time, no matter where we are, we know exactly what's happening with the cats. Plus we can sort on it. So like we've been able to determine sometimes if a cat has a skin issue. Well, it always has a skin issue in the fall. So we know there's something that's blooming in the fall that's causing that cat to have an allergy. But we couldn't tell that from the paper type systems. So what I've done is I've created a sanctuary in a box, and we've duplicated all of our training. We have dozens and dozens of classes that people have to take in order to progress through. And all of that stuff is put in a single unit that I can then set up for other sanctuaries. And the results of being able to have such a streamlined way of dealing with all of the minutiae of running a sanctuary is that you can give better vet care because you can see these trends, and you have more time to go out and do the things that the cats really love, like the operant conditioning or enrichment. We do a lot of enrichment with the cats where they might get a paper bag full of catnip, or we go play with laser pointers, or we'll play in the hose with them when it's hot, or give them watermelons or pumpkins or whatever is seasonal, Christmas trees, all of those kinds of things so that they have something different to tear up and play with. And we couldn't do that if we were bogged down in the paper systems that are just so time consuming. Plus streamlining all of the training, that's really made it, we've started doing video training. So instead of a teacher having to teach a class to a person when they're new, they just sit down in front of the computer and they learn it themselves, and then we give them a test at the end to make sure they got it. So that saves our trainers tons of time that they were spent training people. Now they can be out working with animals.
You said you have like 100+ volunteers.
Yes.
Earlier. How do you coordinate all of that?
Largely through this intranet site that we have, the Google Education apps. But it's been a really interesting thing. We were just recently named the #1 charity in the Tampa Bay area, which is like 2 million people in the Tampa Bay area, out of, I think they said out of 60 some odd charities, we were #1 because we use most of the donation for the animals. And we only have 14 paid staff, and yet all of our animal care is done by volunteers. And so the volunteer program has to be very structured. We do it like a stoplight. When they first start, they have to put in 4 hours a week. They wear a red shirt. Red is stop. They can't go anywhere by themselves. They can't be taking care of any of the animals by themselves. And then after 3 months in the gift shop, I'm sorry, am I boring you?
No. I had a very late night last night. No, this is actually really interesting to me.
So after 3 months working in the gift shop and backing up tours, the red shirts can then start to work with the little cats, and they do that with supervision, so that we're making sure they're cleaning the cage right, they're changing the water, they're filling it all the way to the top every day, that they're observing the cats and knowing what it is that they're seeing and making their log reports correctly. After 6 months, they can graduate to a yellow shirt. Yellow is cautionary. They have to take a whole bunch of classes. They have to pass all these tests. But then they can go to yellow, which means you can take care of cats up to the size of a cougar. But they have to put in 6 hours a week instead of 4 hours a week. After 2 years of all this more training and more classes and more testing, then they can graduate to green. And green are the people who take care of the lions, tigers, and leopards, which is what everybody really wants to do. They all want to work with the big cats. They don't care about the bobcats or the servals. They want to work with the big cats. But before they can ever be in that area with those cats, they've spent 2 years taking care of smaller cats. So we know that they're going to be safe, and we know that they're not going to ever touch an animal. They're never going to stick their hand on the side of the cage or anything dangerous like that, because we've been watching them for 2 years. And we do have a no-touch policy. If anybody touches a cat, they are immediately fired. They are never allowed back onto the property. And when I say fired, even if you're just a volunteer, you're still going to be fired.
Yeah.
We also have interns, and we have like 17 interns who live with us. They live on property. They live here for 3 months at a time. They can't have an outside job because they're working for us 6 days a week, and we give them a small stipend for food and groceries and such, but it's minimal. It's like $25 a week. So
Yeah.
they pretty much have to be able to support themselves from money they've saved for 3 months in order to come here and just work like crazy. But they are awesome, absolutely awesome. And they come from everywhere. We have people from Spain and Portugal and New Zealand and Australia, lots of people from Australia, Canada, Mexico, everywhere you can imagine.
Oh, that's great. I would have expected them to like be mostly Florida natives or something.
No, it's really rare when we have somebody that's local, that's an intern.
Okay. So what's kind of your favorite thing of working here day to day? Something that you get to do on a regular basis that just kind of like brings a smile to your face.
Well, there's two things. One is not so every day, and the other is every day. The thing that I love most about working here is our rehab program. If a bobcat gets hit by a car or orphaned or shot by a hunter or whatever, we bring that animal in, we nurse them back to health, and for me the very happiest day is the day that we open up that door and let that animal run back to freedom where they belong. I mean, we just all stand around bawling our eyes out because we're so happy that this animal finally got a second chance to go back where they belong. The second thing that I do get to do every day is see this intern program be so phenomenal, because this is seeding the planet with people who get it. They understand after they've been with us for 3 months that these animals don't belong in cages, and these animals are way, way too smart for all of the stuff that we force on them. And so as they go home to all of their different countries, they're taking back an entirely different perspective in most cases from the way that they actually came here. Most people who come here as an intern think that they want to get a job working at a circus or at a zoo or doing some animal exploitation, because they don't understand how exploitive it is for the animal. And after 3 months here of seeing that every one of these animals is an individual and has their own agenda that does not include entertaining humans, they go back to their homes and bring that to their communities.
I think I've kind of got enough to at least put together a 6 or 7 item pitch.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been great. I like this a lot. This has been a great perspective. I had no idea that handling cubs was such a big deal. This was really kind of eye-opening. Thanks so much.
It's funny you should say I had no idea, because that's the one thing I hear on tours more than anything else. People always say, I had no idea.
And I think that ought to do it.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you.
Bye.